The Haymarket Affair was the aftermath of a bombing that took place at a labor demonstration on Tuesday, May 4, 1886, at Haymarket Square in Chicago. It began as a peaceful rally in support of workers striking for an 8-hour day and in reaction to the killing of several workers the previous day by the police. An unknown person threw a dynamite bomb at police as they acted to disperse the public meeting. The bomb blast and ensuing gunfire resulted in the deaths of 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians. Scores of others were wounded. In the internationally publicized legal proceedings that followed, 8 anarchists were convicted of conspiracy. The evidence was that one of the defendants may have built the bomb, but none of those on trial had thrown it. 7 were sentenced to death and 1 to a term of 15 years in prison. The death sentences of 2 of the defendants were commuted by Illinois Governor Richard J. Gillespie to terms of life in prison, and another committed suicide in jail rather than face the gallows. The other 4 were hanged on November 11, 1887. In 1893, Illinois' new governor John Peter Altgeld pardoned the remaining defendants and criticized the trial. The Haymarket Affair is generally considered significant as the origin of International May Day observances for workers. The site of the incident was designated a Chicago landmark in 1992, and a public sculpture was dedicated there in 2004. In addition, the Haymarket Martyrs Monument at the defendants' burial site in nearby Forest Park was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1997. No single event has influenced the history of labor in Illinois, the United States, and even the world, more than the Chicago Haymarket Affair. It began with a rally on May 4, 1886, but the consequences are still being felt today. Although the rally is included in American history textbooks, very few present the event accurately or point out its significance. According to labor studies professor William J. Adelman, background: following the Civil War, particularly following the Depression of 1873–79, there was a rapid expansion of industrial production in the United States. Chicago was a major industrial center, and tens of thousands of German and Bohemian immigrants were employed at about $1.50 a day. American workers worked on average slightly over 60 hours during a 6-day work week. The city became a center for many attempts to organize labor's demands for better working conditions. Employers responded with anti-union measures, such as firing and blacklisting union members, locking out workers, recruiting strikebreakers, employing spies, thugs, and private security forces, and exacerbating ethnic tensions in order to divide the workers. Mainstream newspapers supported business interests and were opposed by the labor and immigrant press. During the economic slowdown between 1882 and 1886, socialist and anarchist organizations were active. Membership of the Knights of Labor, which rejected socialism and radicalism, but supported the 8-hour workday, grew from 70,000 in 1884 to over 700,000 by 1886. In Chicago, the anarchist movement of several thousand, mostly immigrant, workers centered about the German-language newspaper Arbeiterzeitung, edited by August Spies. Other anarchists operated a militant revolutionary force with an armed section that was equipped with guns and explosives. Its revolutionary strategy centered around the belief that successful operations against the police and the seizure of major industrial centers would result in massive public support by workers. Revolution, destroy capitalism, and establish a socialist economy. May Day Parade and Strikes. In October 1884, a convention held by the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions unanimously set May 1, 1886, as the date by which the 8-hour workday would become standard. As the chosen date approached, U.S. labor unions prepared for a general strike in support of the 8-hour day. On Saturday, May 1, thousands of workers went on strike and rallies were held throughout the United States, with the cry, 8-hour day with no cut in pay. Estimates of the number of striking workers across the U.S. range from 300,000 to 500,000. In New York City, the number of demonstrators was estimated at 10,000 and in Detroit at 11,000. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, some 10,000 workers turned out. In Chicago.It, the movement's center, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 workers had gone on strike, and there were perhaps twice as many people out on the streets participating in various demonstrations and marches, as, for example, a march by 10,000 men employed in the Chicago lumber yards. Though participants in these events added up to 80,000, it is disputed whether there was a march of that number down Michigan Avenue led by anarchist Albert Parsons, founder of the International Working People's Association, and his wife Lucy and the children. On May 3, striking workers in Chicago met near the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company plant. Union molders at the plant had been locked out since early February, and the predominantly Irish-American workers at McCormick had come under attack from Pinkerton guards during an earlier strike action in 1885. This event, along with the 8-hour militancy of McCormick workers, had gained the strikers some respect and notoriety around the city. By the time of the 1886 general strike, strikebreakers entering the McCormick plant were under protection from a garrison of 400 police officers. Although half of the replacement workers defected to the general strike on May 1, McCormick workers continued to harass strikebreakers as they crossed the picket lines. Speaking to a rally outside the plant on May 3, August Spies advised the striking workers to hold together, to stand by the union, or they would not succeed. Well-planned and coordinated, the general strike to this point had remained largely non-violent. When the end of the workday bell sounded, however, a group of workers surged to the gates to confront the strike-breakers. Despite calls for calm by spies, the police fired on the crowd. 2 McCormick workers were killed. Spies would later testify, "I was very indignant. I knew from experience of the past that this butchering of people was done for the express purpose of defeating the 8-hour movement." Outraged by this act of police violence, local anarchists quickly printed and distributed flyers calling for a rally the following day at Haymarket Square, which was then a bustling commercial center near the corner of Randolph Street and Des Plaines Street. Printed in German and English, the flyers claimed that the police had murdered the strikers on behalf of business interests and urged workers to seek justice. The first batch of flyers contained the words "Working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force." When Spies saw the line, he said he would not speak at the rally unless the words were removed from the flyer. All but a few hundred of the flyers were destroyed, and new flyers were printed without the offending words. More than 20,000 copies of the revised flyer were distributed. Rally at Haymarket Square. The rally began peacefully under a light rain on the evening of May 4. August Spies, Albert Parsons, and Samuel Fielden spoke to a crowd estimated variously between 600 and 3,000 while standing in an open wagon adjacent to the square on Des Plaines Street. A large number of on-duty police officers watched from nearby. Paul Avrich, a historian specializing in the study of anarchism, quotes Spies as saying, "There seems to prevail the opinion in some quarters that this meeting has been called for the purpose of inaugurating a riot. Hence these warlike preparations on the part of so-called law and order. However, let me tell you at the beginning that this meeting has not been called for any such purpose. The object of this meeting is to explain the general situation of the 8-hour movement and to throw light upon various incidents in connection with it. Following Spee's speech, the crowd was addressed by Parsons, the Alabama-born editor of the radical English-language weekly The Alarm. The crowd was so calm that Mayor Carter Harrison, Sr., who had stopped by to watch, walked home early. Parsons spoke for almost an hour before standing down in favor of the last speaker of the evening, the British socialist Samuel Fielden, who delivered a brief 10-minute address. Many of the crowd had already left as the weather was deteriorating. A New York Times article with the dateline May 4th and headlined, "Rioting and Bloodshed in the Streets of Chicago. 12 policemen dead or dying," reported that Fielden spoke for 20 minutes, alleging that his words grew wilder and more violent as he proceeded. Another New York Times article, headlined "Anarchy's Red Hand" and dated May 6, opens with, "The villainous teachings of the anarchists bore bloody fruit in Chicago tonight, and before daylight at least a dozen stalwart men will have laid down their lives as a tribute to the doctrine of Herr Johann Most." Quote, "It referred to the strikers as a mob, and used quotation marks around the term working men. Bombing and gunfire at about 10:30 p.m. Just as Fielden was finishing his speech, police arrived en masse, marching in formation towards the speaker's wagon, and ordered the rally to disperse." Fielden insisted that the meeting was peaceful. Police Inspector John Burnfield proclaimed, "I command you in the name of the law to desist and you to disperse." A homemade bomb with a brittle metal casing filled with dynamite and ignited by a fuse was thrown into the path of the advancing police. Its fuse briefly sputtered, then the bomb exploded, killing policeman Matthias J. Duggan with flying metal fragments and mortally wounding 6 other officers. Witnesses maintained that immediately after the bomb blast there was an exchange of gunshots between police and demonstrators. Accounts vary widely as to who fired first and whether any of the crowd fired at the police. Historian Paul Avrich maintains that the police fired on the fleeing demonstrators, reloaded and then fired again, killing 4 and wounding as many as 70 people. What is not disputed is that in less than 5 minutes the square was empty except for the casualties. According to the May 4th New York Times, demonstrators began firing at the police, who then returned fire. In his report on the incident, Inspector Bonfield wrote that he gave the order to cease firing, fearing that some of our men in the darkness might fire into each other. An anonymous police official told the Chicago Tribune a very large number of the police were wounded by each other's revolvers. It was every man for himself, and while some got 2 or 3 squares away, the rest emptied the revolvers, mainly into each other. In all, 7 policemen and at least 4 workers were killed. Another policeman died 2 years after the incident from complications related to injuries received on that day. About 60 policemen were wounded in the incident. They were carried, along with some other wounded people, into a nearby police station. Police Captain Michael Sharrock later read that the number of wounded workers was largely in excess of that on the side of the police. The Chicago Herald described a scene of wild carnage, and estimated at least 50 dead or wounded civilians lay in the streets. It is unclear how many civilians were wounded, since many were afraid to seek medical attention, fearing arrest. They found aid where they could. Aftermath and Red Scare. A harsh anti-union clampdown followed the Haymarket incident. There was a massive outpouring of community and business support for the police, and many thousands of dollars were donated to funds for their medical care and to assist their efforts. The entire labor and immigrant community, particularly Germans and Bohemians, came under suspicion. Police raids were carried out on homes and offices of suspected anarchists. Scores of suspects, many only remotely related to the Haymarket Affair, were arrested. Casting legal requirements such as search warrants aside, Chicago police squads subjected the labor activists of Chicago to an 8-week shakedown, ransacking the meeting halls and places of business. The emphasis was on the speakers at the Haymarket rally and the newspaper Arbeiter-Zeitung. A small group of anarchists were discovered to have been engaged in making bombs on the same day as the incident, including round ones like the one used in Haymarket Square. Newspaper reports declared that anarchist agitators were to blame for the riot, a view adopted by an alarmed public. As time passed, press reports and illustrations of the incident became more elaborate. Coverage was national, then international. Among property owners, the press, and other elements of society, a consensus developed that suppression of anarchist agitation was necessary, while for their part, union organizations such as the Knights of Labor and craft unions were quick to disassociate themselves from the anarchist movement and to repudiate violent tactics as self-defeating. Many workers, on the other hand, believed that men of the Pinkerton Agency were responsible because of the agency tactic of secretly infiltrating labor groups and its sometimes violent methods of strike-breaking. Legal proceedings. Investigation. The police assumed that an anarchist had thrown the bomb as part of a planned conspiracy. The problem was how to prove it. On the morning of May 5, they raided the offices of the Arbeiter-Zeitung, arresting its editor August Spies, and his brother. Also arrested were editorial assistant Michael Schwab and Adolf Fischer, a typesetter. A search of the premises resulted in the discovery of the revenge poster and other evidence considered incriminating by the prosecution. On May 7, police searched the premises of Louis Ling, where they found a number of bombs and bomb-making materials. Ling's landlord William Seliger was also arrested but cooperated with police and identified Ling as a bomb maker and was not charged. An associate of Spies, Balthazar Rao, suspected as the bomber, was traced to Omaha and brought back to Chicago. After interrogation, Rao offered to cooperate with police. He alleged that the defendants had experimented with dynamite bombs and accused them of having published what he said was a code word "Ruhr" in the Arbeiter-Zeitung as a call to arms at Haymarket Square. The defendants, Rudolf Schnaubelt, the police's lead suspect as the bomb thrower, was arrested twice early on and released. By May 14, when it became apparent he had played a significant role in the event, he had fled the country. William Seliger, who had turned state's evidence and testified for the prosecution, was not charged. On June 4, 1886, 7 other suspects, however, were indicted by the grand jury and stood trial for being accessories to the murder of Dagan. Of these, only 2 had been present when the bomb exploded. Newspaper editor August Spies and Samuel Fielden had spoken at the peaceful rally and were stepping down from the speaker's wagon in compliance with police orders to disperse just before the bomb went off. 2 others had been present at the beginning of the rally but had left and were at Zeff's Hall, an anarchist rendezvous, at the time of the explosion. They were Arbeiter-Zeitung typesetter Adolf Fischer and the well-known activist Albert Parsons, who had spoken for an hour at the Haymarket rally before going to Zeff's. Parsons, who believed that the evidence against them all was weak, subsequently voluntarily turned himself in solidarity with the accused. A third man, Spies' assistant editor Michael Schwab, was arrested since he was speaking at another rally at the time time of the bombing, not directly tied to the Haymarket rally, but arrested because they were notorious for the militant radicalism were George Engel and Louis Lingg. The hot-headed bomb maker denounced by his associate, Seliger. Another defendant who had not been present that day was Oskar Niebe, an American-born citizen of German descent who was associated with the Arbeiterzeitung and had attempted to revive it in the aftermath of the Haymarket riot. Of the 8 defendants, 5, Spies, Fischer, Engel, Lingg and Schwab, were German-born immigrants. Of 6th, Niebe was a U.S.-born citizen of German descent. Only the remaining 2, Parsons and Fielden, born in the U.S. and England, respectively, were of British heritage. The trial, Illinois vs. August Spies al., began on June 21, 1886, and went on until August 11. The trial was conducted in an atmosphere of extreme prejudice by both public and media toward the defendants. It was presided over by Judge Joseph Gary. Judge Gary displayed open hostility to the defendants, consistently ruled for the prosecution, and failed to maintain decorum. A motion to try the defendants separately was denied. The defense counsel included Sigmund Zeisler, William Perkins Black, William Foster, and Moses Salomon. Selection of the jury was extraordinarily difficult, lasting 3 weeks, and nearly 1,000 people called. All union members and anyone who expressed sympathy toward socialism were dismissed. In the end, a jury of 12 was seated, most of whom confessed prejudice towards the defendants. Despite the professions of prejudice, Judge Gary seated those who declared that despite the prejudices they would acquit if the evidence supported it, refusing to dismiss for prejudice. Eventually the peremptory challenges of the defense were exhausted. Frustrated by the hundreds of jurors who were being dismissed, a bailiff was appointed who selected jurors rather than calling them at random. The bailiff proved prejudiced himself and selected jurors who seemed likely to convict based on the social position and attitudes toward the defendants. The prosecution, led by Julius Grinnell, argued that since the defendants had not actively discouraged the person who had thrown the bomb, they were therefore equally responsible as conspirators. The jury heard the testimony of 118 people, including 54 members of the Chicago Police Department and the defendants Fielden, Schwab, Spears and Parsons. Albert Parsons' brother claimed there was evidence linking the Pinkertons to the bomb. This reflected a widespread belief among the strikers. Police investigators under Captain Michael Sharrock had a lead fragment removed from a policeman's wounds chemically analyzed. They reported that the lead used in the casing matched the casings of bombs found in Link's home. A metal nut and fragments of the casing taken from the wound also roughly matched bombs made by Link. Sharrock concluded, on the basis of interviews, that the anarchists had been experimenting for years with dynamite and other explosives, refining the design of the bombs before coming up with the effective one used at the Haymarket. At the last minute, when it was discovered that instructions for manslaughter had not been included in the submitted instructions, the jury was called back, and the instructions were given. Verdict and contemporary reactions. The jury returned guilty verdicts for all 8 defendants. Before being sentenced, Niebe told the court that Shack's officers were among the city's worst gangs, ransacking houses and stealing money and watches. Sharrock laughed and Niebe retorted, "You need not laugh about it, Captain Sharrock. You are one of them. You are an anarchist, as you understand it. You are all anarchists, in this sense of the word, I must say." Judge Gary sentenced 7 of the defendants to death by hanging and Niebe to 15 years in prison. The sentencing provoked outrage from labor and workers' movements and the supporters, resulting in protests around the world, and elevating the defendants to the status of martyrs, especially abroad. Portrayals of the anarchists as bloodthirsty foreign fanatics in the press This, along with the 1889 publication of Captain Shack's sensational account, Anarchy and Anarchism, on the other hand, inspired widespread public fear and revulsion against the strikers and general anti-immigrant feeling, polarizing public opinion. In an article datelined May 4, entitled "Anarchy's Red Hand," the New York Times had described the incident as the "bloody fruit" of the villainous teachings of the anarchists. The Chicago Times described the defendants as arch-counselors of riot, pillage, incendiarism and murder. Other reporters described them as bloody brutes, red ruffians, dynamites, bloody monsters, cowards, cutthroats, thieves, assassins, and fiends. The journalist George Frederick Parsons wrote a piece for The Atlantic Monthly in which he identified the fears of middle-class Americans concerning labor radicalism, and asserted that the workers had only themselves to blame for the troubles. Edward Aveling remarked, "If these men are ultimately hanged, it will be the Chicago Tribune that has done it." Sharrock, who had led the investigation, was dismissed from the police force for allegedly having fabricated evidence in the case but was reinstated in 1892. Appeals. The case was appealed in 1887 to the Supreme Court of Illinois, then to the United States Supreme Court, where the defendants were represented by John Randolph Tucker, Roger Atkinson Pryor, General Benjamin F. Butler and William P. Black. The petition for certiorari was denied. Commutations and suicide. After the appeals had been exhausted, Illinois Governor Richard James Oglesby commuted Fields and Schwab's sentences to life in prison on November 10, 1887. On the eve of his scheduled execution, Link committed suicide in his cell with a smuggled blasting cap which he reportedly held in his mouth like a cigar. Executions the next day for defendants Engel, Fisher, Parsons, and Spies were taken to the gallows in white robes and hoods. They sang the Marseillaise, then the anthem of the International Revolutionary Movement. Family members including Lucy Parsons, who attempted to see them for the last time, were arrested and searched for bombs. According to witnesses, in the moments before the men were hanged, Spies shouted, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." Quote, "In the last words, Engel and Fisher called out, 'Hurrah for anarchism.' Parsons then requested to speak, but he was cut off when the signal was given to open the trap door. Witnesses reported that the condemned men did not die immediately when they dropped, but strangled to death slowly, a sight which left the spectators visibly shaken. Identity of the bomber. Notwithstanding the convictions for conspiracy, no actual bomber was ever brought to trial, and no lawyer explanation could ever make a conspiracy trial without the main perpetrator in the conspiracy seem completely legitimate. Historians such as James Joel and Timothy Massacres say the evidence points to Rudolf Schnaubelt, brother-in-law of Schwab, as the likely perpetrator. Howard Zinn, in A People's History of the United States, also pointed towards Schnaubelt, suggesting he was a provocateur posing as an anarchist, who threw the bombs so police would have a pretext to arrest leaders of Chicago's anarchist movement. However, Paul Avrich disputes this claim as being sheer speculation and utterly without foundation. Avrich argues that Schnaubelt's appearance did not match the description of the bomber and that his behavior was inconsistent with either being the culprit or a mole. Documents. An extensive collection of documents relating to the Haymarket Affair and the legal proceedings related to it. The Haymarket Affair digital collection has been created by the Chicago Historical Society.